Good morning. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Wednesday, February 25th. Two of our members are attending by Zoom, Tiff and Robin. And we have on our agenda today, we are going to look at a bill this morning, H567. And then at 11 o'clock, we'll be hearing from various legislators telling us about their specific interest in the budget coming along. And then in the afternoon, we have two more bills to look at, H542 and H578. So we are going to look at 567 first, and we have Matt Barron from the Committee of Government Operations, and Cameron Wood, our attorney as well, and we have Chris Root available. So one or all of you can come up front. I guess we'll let Matt describe it first, along with Cam.
Yes. Thank you very much, Madam Vice Chair. Thank you, committee. So yeah, the bill in front of you, H567, is a compilation, wow, of copy of work. A lot of this happened before we even got into session. There's a great deal of effort between stakeholders, the Treasurer's Office, Legislative Council, to put this proposal together. It covers a pretty broad range of topics: retirement systems, unclaimed property, adjustments to some probate court, things of that nature. So it really is, it touches on a lot of points that are within the Treasurer's jurisdiction. As far as our committee work, we took extensive testimony, and for the first time in my legislative career, we voted a bill out as introduced from committee. It was really kind of amazing. So sort of where I'm building up to with that was there was a lot of really diligent work that went into this. And when we brought in all the, interested parties, affected organizations and whatnot, there was broad support for the words on the page that are in front of you.
Mr. Wood, would you please lead us through this bill?
Yes, ma'am. I'd be happy to. For the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'll share my screen and kind of walk through. For a 36-page bill, I think this can actually be relatively succinct in the description of what's actually changing here. For the first few sections, we have amendments to the statutes related to unclaimed properties. And the language here is, more technical amendments as opposed to substantive, but I will comment on each of them. The first in section 1, when you look at the bottom of this page, the subsection 5, what's changing here is it's allowing the Treasurer's Office to seek more information when they receive unclaimed properties from certain entities. So as you can see here in the sub 5, if it's an unclaimed property that's held under a life, we're adding medical or endowment insurance policy. The change here is going to allow the State Treasurer's Office to ask for an explanation of benefit numbers. Their testimony in the Government Operations Committee was, in a lot of instances, they will just get a large dollar amount coming from these external entities without any further information about whose money it may be or any further description. So this change will allow them to, request for additional information for those monies that are coming in.
I'm looking at it as well as any explanation of benefit numbers. Benefit numbers, what's numbers refer to? Dollars, people?
Yes, it would be the money that they're receiving that's unclaimed property.
Those numbers are good enough word for that spot? Is that descriptive enough?
I believe so, but the information initially came from the Treasurer's Office, so that may be a question you want to ask them to make sure they feel that they have enough information there to make the changes that they're seeking. But my understanding is yes. I mean, as the testimony was given, again, these entities will just provide, a significant chunk of unclaimed property money without any explanation of the numbers that go behind it and whose money it may be. And so this language is intended to allow them to request an explanation of the numbers that are coming to them, the monetary numbers that are coming to them.
Seems vague, not plainly read, but it doesn't inform me as to exactly what they're talking about, dollars or some other numbers. There's a lot of kinds of numbers.
Right. It would be the benefit numbers associated under the life, medical, or endowment insurance policy or annuity contract. So, okay. Moving to the next page. So this is page 3. We're moving on to section 2. What this is going to do is currently, and I'm going to have to come back to this section, but I'll pause here and explain what the bill as introduced would do. This section says in the lead-in, the lines 3 and 4, before making a deposit of funds received to the general fund. So this is unclaimed property. The treasurer's office is required to set aside and maintain a certain amount of unclaimed property to ensure that they're able to pay the benefits, or pay the claims that people are filing each year. So they receive the unclaimed property, they hold it, individual comes to them, finds that they have unclaimed property, they request it, the treasurer's office has to pay it out. So there are statutory sections that require the treasurer's office to maintain a certain amount to be able to pay those claims that come in. And then they do also transfer funds to the general fund each year. So they don't just hold all the unclaimed properties that they receive forever into perpetuity because, you know, they're old, people aren't going to claim them, et cetera. So they do make transfers to the general fund. What this section is saying is before they make those transfers, they're able to deduct certain things. And part of that is, as you can see in the 1 through 4, expenses, costs of mailing, publication, service charges, et cetera. And then when you get to the sub 5, currently, property that's valued at less than $100, that's more than 10 years old, the treasurer's office transfers those funds to, look at line 17, the Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund, created in 16 VSA 2885. What this bill would do is it would divert those monies to the Vermont Saves Administrative Fund for a certain period of time. And I'm going to pause because I'm going to come back to this section because the House Ways and Means Committee is proposing an amendment to this to clarify further the intent behind what the Treasurer's Office was seeking to do. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to come back to this section. Yes, sir.
Line 16, the number there looks strange.
The 300,000. So I'm going to come back to that because there's potentially an edit I'm going to ask you all to make on the Ways and Means amendment that came through. So, okay, section 3 is simply repealing that diversion of the funds away from the Higher Education Endowment Fund to the Vermont Saves Fund. So it's a sunset on that shift in money. But again, I'm gonna come back to this when I get to the Ways and Means amendment. So section 4 and section 5, these sections are amending certain thresholds that apply to the unclaimed property division. So when you look at section 1553, this requires that individuals that are claiming property have to provide certain information to the treasurer's office to validate its completeness and accuracy, that they, have that it's their money. And then when you get to the sub B, looking at the top of page 5, this allows the treasurer's office, as it was described in government operations, to kind of make a fast claims process. They don't have to require certain documentation of the individual, original documentation. They don't have to require notarization, et cetera, things like that. So if the value itself is under this $250 threshold, they're able to just move those claims much more quickly through the process so the individual can access those dollars. Their proposal here is to increase that threshold from $250 to $1,000. And then in section 5, similarly, what this section does is it's dealing with estates and where the individual who owns the property is deceased. And what we're saying here is In the case of a closed estate, if it's less than 5,000, then the treasurer's office can distribute the money in accordance with the decree of distribution for that estate. And then if there is no open estate and there is no decree of distribution, then they can distribute it to the surviving spouse or to the next of kin in accordance with, Vermont statute that kind of identifies how those funds are distributed out. And they're proposing to increase these thresholds from 5,000 to 10,000. And as you can see under the sub 4, if it's above these thresholds, then they are required to reopen the estate in order to distribute the funds. So it's kind of increasing those thresholds from 5 to 10 to make it easier to distribute those funds in the event there is this decree of distribution that already exists. And then moving to the top of page 6, similarly, just a threshold here. If there are more than one individuals who own the property, it's saying that if the value is under 250 and the proposal to increase it to 1,000, it gives the treasurer kind of statutory authority to distribute that money to either the first person who claims it or to a proportionate share to the individuals who are claiming it. So it's just those two sections 4 and 5, like I said, are just increasing these thresholds by which the treasurer's office can more quickly distribute money out and according to those statutory sections.
Did you hear that there was kind of a backlog because of this 250 limit as opposed to, did the treasurer's office have too many sitting there because it was a 250 limit and it took them longer to process them?
I don't want to speak for them. I don't remember hearing them say that there was a backlog, but I know they have testified that there has been, kind of an ongoing increase in the number of, claims that they have been distributing out. So I know that that was comments that was made. This will also help, alleviate the burden from their small administrative team and trying to ensure that these claims are processed as quickly as possible because they have had a continued increase in volume of claims that have been going out. Okay, so that ends the unclaimed property section. So now for the next few, we're going to move into the Vermont State Retirement System. This first section here on section 6 is addressing, and I'm going to move to page 7 because sub B is really where the change is here. There are certain municipal employers that participate in the state's retirement system. And what this section would do is it would authorize the treasurer's office, the board, the pension system to apply penalties and interest to those employers if they are not paying their employer's share timely. So as you can see under the B, payments due that are not received within 30 days after the installment date set by the board result in a penalty assessment against the employer at a rate of 1% of the amount due for each month calculated and provided that the board may waive. So it's really standard language there, but the key thing is it's authorizing the board to assess those penalties against a municipal political subdivision that's participating in the state retirement system. Okay. Section 7 is creating a pension and benefits funding task force. And the intent of the task force is here, looking at kind of line 15 to report on the funding methodologies of the Vermont State Retirement System and the state teachers retirement system. You have membership of the task force. So we have the chair of appropriations, House and Senate, secretary of administration, state treasurer.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
One
9,
member
10, 11,
appointed by
12,
the
13,
NEA,
14.
one member appointed by the Vermont State Employees Association, one member appointed by the president of the Vermont Troopers. And then the task force is reviewing existing funding schedules and methodologies. And then you have here a little more detail on what they're required to look at. This is going to be on page 9, long-term sustainability of the plans, total cost of funding of the system, predictability and stability of the system, etc. Key thing is under the 3, the task force shall not make recommendations on member benefits, contribution levels, or assumed rates of return. My understanding is here they're looking to have this task force come in and really, do kind of a comprehensive assessment of where you're at with the funding systems, the pension systems. And I can kind of let Chris better explain this section when he joins you, if you have specific questions.
And Stevens.
Wasn't there a similar task force that was put into place some years ago when the pension funds were in crisis? And this seems, I'd say duplicative, but why is? Thank you for your last sentence. But the idea here is what as compared to what was and what exists, because there was a big 2 years, workout on the functionality of pensions. We've taken testimony where the pensions seem to be healthy. The process, all of these things that it's being asked to look at. We took testimony and said these things, at least in the moment, are stable. Many miles to go to refund it, but that's not what this is for. Is this a group of ombudsmen? Is this a group of people who are a board of directors for VPIC or for the people who are running the funds?
Chris.
Chris Rowe, Joint Fiscal, Representative Stevens, that's very good memory you had a few years ago of that pension task force. The prior group had a much larger charge than this one. That group really did look at like the entire systems writ large, including what the benefit plans look like in terms of the benefits, employee contributions, the whole 9 yards. This is intended to be a much more limited scope of work for a group of similar stakeholders where you have legislators and members of the employee unions. This would not look at the benefit structure and things of that nature. My understanding is the focus here is really on our amortization policy. And right now in statute, our unfunded liabilities are to be amortized by fiscal 2038. But as we get closer to that date, I'll go into this when I'm in the chair, but there's higher risk of contribution volatility if something weird happens in the market because you're running out of years to spread the impact across. And we need to have a conversation about what does life after 2038 look like at some point, because we're going to need to have a system in place to deal with unfunded liabilities that crop up from time to time. So this is really looking at that piece of the equation. And it's a very narrow focus. It's on, what should our funding policy at the state for the unfunded liability?
Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to ask the same question Tom had, but it looked like duplication to me. But then the next question after listening to Chris is, we have a VPIC group that was spun off just a couple of years ago, and that does the actual examination of the sustainability, total cost, predictability, impact, and is the advisory group for this. And I believe this calls for the addition of a position to help them do some things to deal with OPEB, because OPEB is even a bigger variety of variability as it gets closer. How does this work if we now have VPIC?
So real quick, and then I'll also defer to Chris. So there isn't a position associated with this study. This is just a limited task
Not with
force.
this study, but there is one mentioned in the, and VPIC is asking for one.
Yes, ma'am, because the next few sections of the bill are going to be transferring the OPEB benefits from the treasurer's office to be under the administrative and fiduciary responsibility of VPIC. And so I think they are asking for a position to kind of administer that transition, and they will be administering those funds. So they're asking for a position for that.
Yeah, but is this duplicative
I
to
think
what VPIC does?
this would be separate. Chris, you want to
These
jump in?
are two totally separate. The piece you mentioned, Representative Dickinson, with the position you need has to do with managing OPEB and shifting that over from the treasurer's office to VPIC. This group here, this is a task force that really doesn't have anything to do with the investments or the actuarial assumptions. This task force is really just going to look at the state's funding policies for the pension unfunded liability and what types of statutory changes might need to be made to reduce volatility risk going forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Shy online has a question.
Hi, thank you. I think some of it's been answered. I remember speaking with the treasurer this fall about the notion that the volatility becomes more of a concern the closer we get to 2038. And I think that's what I heard Chris say is the reason for this. I'm wondering why the chairs of House and Senate Appropriations are supposed to be on this committee. Chris, do you have some thoughts about that?
I would defer to the treasurer's office on that. I think if I were to speculate, I think some of the logic is that this specific issue is really about funding and about budgetary pressures on the government as opposed to retirement plan design or things of that nature. And I think this is really about coming up with a policy that directly intersects with the work of the appropriations committees.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Since for right now. Okay, continue.
Okay, so I will just comment, we have a lot of boilerplate language in here about the task force, but the report is due on December 15th of this year. And then the one piece that I wanted to highlight as well is it has an appropriation of $75,000. Here in the sub H on page 11, $75,000 is appropriated to the Office of the State Treasurer for costs associated with administering the task force, including per diems and reimbursement of expenses and costs associated with the advisory services. Just wanted to mention that.
It's comes from the general fund.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, now,
One question.
And so I just wanted to ask the question. If this is the treasurer's gig, then wouldn't this come out of the overhead that might be assigned to them for management of the funds?
that is a question I would defer to them unless Chris wants to.
I would say customarily, whenever there's been studies done for the pension systems, that has come from general fund appropriations, not from the corpus of the pension assets, which for lots of legal reasons that I am not qualified to speak to, are held in trust for the exclusive benefit of the plan participants. So there's sort of restrictions on what you can use that money for, coming out of the assets of the fund. Typically, when we've done the task force a few years ago, and anytime the legislature has asked the treasurer's office to look at studying different things, provided a one-time general fund appropriation.
Lynn?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, there's 7 members on this committee. Many of them are gonna be paid by their employers. We need $75,000, or maybe 2 or 3 people at the most.
The per diems are a minimal piece of that cost, that would almost entirely to fund actuarial work. So, when you all did the task force a few years ago, I think we received a $150,000 appropriation for that. And most of that money went to fund actuarial.
So you hire a consultant.
We already have a consultant on board, it's just a matter of, you have to pay them to run ad hoc scenarios.
Yeah, sorry.
Good job. It's
The
okay.
different.
Chris, Rick can answer this question. Are there a certain number of meetings that it would take to actuate this task force and their charge here? I may have not seen it.
Yes, 6 meetings.
Yes, okay,
Top of that page 11.
okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so
You?
we are on section 8, page 11. I'm going to pause here. Sections 8 through sections 20. This is page 11 through page 32. Everything in these sections is about moving the administrative and, fiduciary obligation administration of the other post-employment benefits funds for the state retirement system and the teachers' retirement system, moving it out from under the somewhat sole administrative responsibility of the state treasurer and moving it under the Pension Investment Commission. There is no new language in these sections. It is primarily striking language that currently exists under either the state pension retirement chapter or the state teachers retirement chapter, and moving the language over to exist under the Vermont Pension Investment Commission chapter. So, for example, when you look at section 9, page 15, this has the state treasurer is the custodian of the assets of the fund of the retirement system. So this is, kind of speaking about the other post-employment benefit funds. And it has certain standards of conduct that apply to members of the commission, but this is technically not in the VPIC section. It's in the state retirement section. All of this language is being mirrored over. I apologize for the scroll. All of this language, for example, is being, and just that, I'm just talking about that one piece, is being moved right over here into a standards of conduct section related to VPIC. That's saying that the commissions shall, the employees of the commission can't have a direct interest in the gains or profits of any investments made by the commission. That's the exact same language that was in the section I was at, previously under section 9, and it's being moved over here kind of word for word. So again, everything from those sections, section 8 through 20, pages 11 through 32, it's just moving the statutory sections over and there's no changes. The large policy change here is moving that fiduciary responsibility from the treasurer's office solely over to exist under VPIC for those two funds, the other post-employment benefit funds for the state employees and for the teachers.
Questions on that part?
Apologies for the long scrolling. I'm going to get us to the next section, which is going to be on page 32. Okay. Now we're dealing with pension credits. The next two sections, section 21 and 22, are about the teachers' retirement system and the municipal retirement system. And it's authorizing a member. So looking at lines 20 and moving forward on the bottom of page 32. So this is in the teachers' retirement system. A member who is elected to serve as the president of an employee organization designated as the exclusive bargaining representative for employees in that chapter. So the NEA, for example, here, allowing a member who has been elected to be president to use that time as serving as president as credited service for their retirement. It requires, when you're looking at lines 5 moving forward, the employee organization shall deposit into the fund an amount computed at regular interest to be sufficient to provide the normal retirement. There's a similar piece in the municipal section. So if a municipal employee is serving as president for their bargaining representative, they can receive credit during that period of time. So technically, they're no longer a member when they're serving as president. So it's allowing them to, when they're serving in that capacity, to have service credited to them as long as their employer is paying into the system an amount necessary to cover the costs of those years of service. And then sub 2 and 3 is simply saying that.
I have a question about that. Sorry.
Go ahead.
It's hard to see my hand up there.
I know, I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
That's okay. So this year of creditable service, so you're saying they're not getting paid their usual salary that year, or are they getting paid extra that year? I mean, how does that compare with other years of salary being credited to their service?
I do not know how those individuals are subsequently paid if they become the president of the bargaining organization. I'm assuming the bargaining organization is going to be paying for their salary at that point in time. That may be a question better for the treasurer's office. they're no longer a member of the system at that point. They're no longer defined as a member. And so that's the issue, is they're not receiving that years of service credit to their retirement. And my understanding is it's somewhat of a disincentive to get individuals to serve in those roles because they're no longer receiving that credit at that point.
Right.
But as
Okay.
far as who's paying their salary, I would defer to someone else for the answer.
Okay, and also how much is it a different than what their normal annual salary would be if they were not the president? So I don't know if somebody can find that out. Lynn, is this yours?
No, well, no, not the salary. This is a different thing.
Oh,
would
this
be-
is the teachers. John,
Yeah.
might be yours.
Yeah, but I have the same
Okay.
question. Is this, who pays the pension? And when it says it pays 2/3, equal to 1 2/3 or 2%, is that 2%? I'm confused as to whether that's salary or is that what they contribute? And who pays it? Does it the school pay it or does the PEA pay it?
Chris.
My understanding from the terms of this bill is that the labor union would be the one paying the cost of the year of service credit, and it would be calculated on an actuarially equivalent basis. So all of those percentages, that references the multiplier formula that is in place for the pension benefit. At the end of the day, the intent here, as I understand it, is that if you left your employment as a teacher to go serve as the president of the labor union, and you're not earning a year of service credit because you're not teaching in that year, then the labor union would make a payment to the retirement system at an actuarially equivalent amount to pay for that year of service.
So they keep their year of service.
That's exactly right.
Okay,
So you don't lose a year of service
Yeah.
by leaving active teaching status to go serve as a president of the labor.
so thank you.
Great,
Okay.
thanks.
Wayne,
So is the intent of this that a teacher leaves employment, becomes president to do this job, gets paid by the union, instead goes in, is the intent of that teacher go back being a teacher?
If they so choose, I think it would depend on if that individual wants to go back to teaching. It's just adding or authorizing that those years that the individual's serving as the president to count towards their retirement. And so then they would still have to meet whatever the normal retirement dates are for whatever that member's group is. And so, whether they decide to maybe retire at the end of serving as president, if they have the normal retirement date, they have the years of service necessary to do so, then they could, or they could go back to teaching and then continue to.
I understand those parts, but what I'm getting at is if you quit a job here, you take a job here, then it should, normally, if you took a job with another organization, they wouldn't be paying into your pension from your previous employment. So I'm just asking, is this reasonable thing to do? It would be one thing if the intent was for an employee to get done that job and then take this other job, which is going to be a benefit to all the folks here as a service with the intent to return to that employment and continue in service. It seems a little disjunct for me to think that it would go from one organization to another.
Understood, and I understand that kind of seems a little odd when you kind of think about it in that sense. I would say they are going to a job as the collective bargaining representing unit of the job in which they're coming from. So I think there is still that somewhat connection. The disconnection isn't as pronounced as if you just took a job with a totally different organization.
It won't result in any additional costs to the state or to the.
I am probably not qualified to say that, but my understanding is no, because it's built in here to say that the employee organization has to pay that cost. And so that would come from whatever that collective bargaining organization would be.
It's the actuary.
Yes.
And Chris said it has to be actuarially neutral. So it the intent here, based on the language on the page, is such that it's not going to cost the state any money to pay for that, and it shouldn't impact the retirement system due to the benefits of that individual because it's intended to be neutral.
That's my point, whether it includes some future obligation on the part of the state or
No, sir.
costs. That's good.
Because the inflow is from the bucket, from the organization for that moment in time. And then when that ceases, the individual perhaps goes back to work, perhaps they retire, perhaps they do something else. Yeah.
Donald, do you still have a question?
Not so much a question, but I think to be helped clarify this a little bit here. They're basically taking a leadership position within this entity here, which they were represented previously. So we see that a lot in union groups here. We certainly see that in higher education where people are to faculty or staff and they take a leadership position within the union that represents them. This is different obviously here, but that's how I look at this.
Yes. Correct.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, the next section is related to capital debt. So this is going to make some very small amendments to the Capital Debt Advisory Committee's report that they submit. And if you look on page 35, so this is for the annual report that the committee submits to the governor and the General Assembly, estimating the net state tax supported debt that prudently may be authorized for the next fiscal year. Within that annual report, they have to include, under the 4, criteria that recognize bond agency ratings used to judge the quality of issues of state bonds, including, and then the amendment is there in the sub D. It was amended, I believe, last year to say other metrics at the committee's discretion. And they're proposing to change this to other metrics adopted by the recognized bond rating agencies. I don't see this as really a significant substantive legal change. My understanding are these changes are more, the committee made recommendations to go with this language and so they're just preferring to go with what the committee recommended as opposed to having it at the committee's discretion. Same thing at the top of page 36. There's a slight change here. The report has to include, currently it says the capital assets depreciation ratio, and this is changing it to be measures reflecting the remaining useful life of the state infrastructure and the potential for future capital maintenance and replacement costs. I don't see this as a legal or a substantive change. My understanding is the committee would prefer and recommended the language that's underlined, and so that's what they're asking you all to do, is go with the language that the Capital Debt Advisory Committee was recommending.
Thank you.
Okay, last 2 sections, you have positions, Office of the State Treasurer, 2 full-time classified program tech 3 positions in the unclaimed property division, and then 1 full-time policy and research manager in the retirement division. And then you have effective dates, July 1, 2026, except that the task force would take effect upon passage to allow them to begin the work immediately. And then section 3 is about the sunset of the funds for the unclaimed property. And so I'm going to bring us back to that. I'll bring us back to that section because Ways and Means does have a recommended amendment. So I'm bringing us all the way back to the beginning on page 3. This section is under the unclaimed properties. And if you all remember, I had mentioned that before money is transferred to the general fund, the treasurer's office is allowed to deduct certain amounts for administrative costs, for mailing, publication, etc. And then for property that is $100 or less, more than 10 years after the property was received, they transfer the money to the Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. Okay. And the proposal here is to divert that money instead to the Vermont Saves Admin Fund to fund that program. this language that was in the bill as introduced, the treasurer's office came in after it was voted out of House Government Operations and indicated that it wasn't exactly what they were intending, so they needed a slight tweak to actually accomplish their desired outcome. So that's why we have this amendment from the Ways and Means Committee. So you can see it looks slightly different. I had to break this out for kind of statutory drafting purposes. As opposed to just reading you the words on the page, I'm just going to tell you what it does. First off, they're increasing that threshold, as you can see on the top of 5 on line 1, from $100 to $150. That was as it was introduced. The key here is under the sub A and the B. Instead of taking all of this money and giving it to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund, the proposal here is to deposit the money in the Vermont Retirement Security Fund. It's on line 5, up to an annual total of $300,000. Notwithstanding that in the administrator's sole discretion, so in the treasurer's sole discretion, funds may go to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. So if you all pass this, instead of all of the money going to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund, it shall go to the Vermont Saves Fund, except that the state treasurer may put some of those monies in the Vermont Higher Education Trust Fund. So you are essentially giving the treasurer's office the decision. Does it go into the Vermont Saves Admin Fund? Does it go into the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund? The treasurer's office would be able to make that decision. Their testimony has been most of it would go into the Vermont Saves Retirement Fund to kind of stabilize the administrative fund for that program. And then over time, they would slowly reduce the monies going there and start to refunnel the money back to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. But you may want to hear from them to answer any specific questions about why and what their intent is with this language. I'm simply highlighting that it would give the treasurer's office the discretion, and it's capped at $300,000 per year. Understand that because you're raising, if this passes as written, because you're raising the threshold from $100 to $150, the first year that this goes into effect, you're going to get a significant amount of money that comes in all at once because that threshold is being raised. The language only authorizes them to transfer up to $300,000 per year. So what is going to happen with the rest of that money that comes in that first year? The treasurer's office would hold it, and then each year they would distribute that up to $300,000 until that money was ultimately transferred over time. So that may be a question you want to ask them at that point. I
It's
will.
also mentioned in the fiscal note that we will eventually get to, and we heard about this when the treasurer comes.
And so I will highlight that it's not money that's being diverted from the general fund in that sense. I mean, this is money that the treasurer's office is able to exclude from the money that they send to the general fund, except that threshold that's being increased. So if you increase the threshold, then, in theory, it impacts the money that would go to the general fund. The last comment that I will make is, unfortunately, as was pointed out, I have made a Scrivener's error there. And so one thing I would ask, if this committee would, if you are intending to make any amendment to the bill, or if you would make an amendment to the House Ways and Means proposal, if you're finding it favorable, is to fix that Scrivener's error that I have on line 6. It should be 300,000, and it's missing.
I see.
Yes, it's missing.
Missing the zero in there. or a comma, or something, a
You
zero.
can't say close enough for government.
Not with zeros.
Just points.
So the last thing I'll mention is there is a section 2 and a section 3. So the section 3 is beginning in January of 2040. It removes the diversion of that money to the Vermont Saves Fund, and it would then go back to how it's currently structured, where all of the money would go to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund. So this is a period of time where the money would be diverted for Vermont Saves.
So there's also an error on the top of it.
Right, I was gonna say,
Yes.
this number is the problem.
It is fixing that in 2 locations, I'm sorry.
So what's,
Yes,
was there any discussion as to why the treasurer would be an appropriate person to make a decision on where the money should be going? In your committee?
Say that, I'm sorry.
In your committee, was there any discussion of why the treasurer would be an appropriate authority to decide whether money went into education or to where it goes?
So within this, it is the administrative cost for the Vermont Saves Fund. And then any like excess, if I'm understanding the path correctly, would either,
Education.
yes, would be diverted over there. Yes.
Just a technical thing, it's not he's not actually directing money to any place that he wouldn't have already been directed.
That is my understanding.
Yeah, I think the treasurer manages that fund
Yeah.
along with all the other funds that he manages, so.
Yeah, it was already in their like governing authority with those funds.
yes, Robin.
Thank you. I knew this was coming. I wondered if either GovOps or Ways and Means considered a sunset on this, or is this going to be a permanent thing? Because it's my understanding that once Vermont Saves got to like 20,000 members or something like that, that it would be fully self-sustaining and they wouldn't need to do this anymore.
Madam Chair, it has a sunset. January of 2040 is built in. So it would give the treasurer's office that discretion through January 1 of 2040, at which point it would, there's language there to sunset it back. So at that point, 2040, it would go back to as it's currently drafted, where all the money would go to the Vermont Higher Education Endowment Trust Fund with a cap of $300,000 per year. But my understanding in a standard year, I don't think they've distributed anywhere near 300,000 in a while, so.
Yeah, okay. But 2040 seems like a very long way away. I'm wondering if we want to consider having a check back. I'm sort of throwing this out to the committee too, sometime before 13 years from now. So something to consider.
Okay,
And that is the bill and the proposed amendment from the House Ways and Means Committee.
thank you. Any
You're
more questions? I think we'll ask Chris perhaps to go over the fiscal note too, but yes.
What was the vote in Ways and Means?
I believe it was 11-0.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, before we go to the fiscal note, is it possible to ask the representative here from the treasurer's office? Because they have their own sort of graduated decrease in this to 2032, like a 5-year, 6-year, it would end up really not going to the Vermont Saves.
Okay, well, let's hear the fiscal note and then we have,
Yeah, it's just a question back to Representative Shy. Robin, suggesting that we should think about perhaps a check back or get information from the committee here that brought this forward here to see if there was conversation about that, or was there not?
We did discuss that timeline since it is longer than usual.
Yeah.
But
Just the idea of a check back.
we did not discuss the idea of the check back. We just discussed whether that was like the appropriate duration for sunset to be in place. And just given the amount of time BT Saves needs to like build up its, pot of money that would
Right.
help fully fund its administrative.
We did look at a timeline. I don't have it off the top of my head how long that was, so. didn't want to make sure that wasn't lost.
It was discussed.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Can you walk us through what's going on?
Good morning, everyone. Again, for the record, Chris Root from the Joint Fiscal Office. I'll pull up the fiscal note right now.
Do we have the fiscal note on our, what was that?
It's posted.
Thank you.
So I think we already covered a lot of what's in here, but I just wanted to mention a few things while I'm in the chair, and I'm mindful of your schedule and your need for a break before your next segment, so I'll try to be brief. But there's a few things going on in this bill. There's the changes to unclaimed property and the allowance of the small dollar old unclaimed property to go to the Vermont Saves program. There is the Pension and Benefits Funding Task Force with its related appropriation. The transition of fiduciary oversight for OPEB, the retiree healthcare systems from the state treasurer over to VPIC. And there are also 3 positions created in the office of the state treasurer in this bill. So I'm going to go to page 2. First of all, I'm just going to flag that those of you who have hard copies, I discovered an error in the hard copy. In the bottom of the second paragraph, pretend that the words without the $300,000 annual cap, pretend those are not in the fiscal note. I struck it from the version that is on the website and the one I'm showing you right now, but I realized I didn't strike it a week ago when Ways and Means was doing its amendment. So what you see on the screen is correct. The hard copies in front of you, if they say without the $300,000 annual cap, just cross out that phrase. There are some graphics here based on some of the projections that the Office of the State Treasurer put together that try to illustrate how this would work in practice. So figure 1 shows you the projected funding sources for Vermont Saves. The green bars reflect the estimated program revenue that would be generated from Vermont Saves from the admin fees that are on participant accounts. As there are more participants in the system and the account balances grow, you would expect those program revenues to keep increasing. And it is expected that by 2033, the program revenues will grow to the point where the Vermont Saves program would be self-sufficient fiscally from fees that it generates. But until then, the proposal is to use this small dollar unclaimed property that's more than 10 years old to help bridge the gap. So that is what that orange or salmon colored bar on the top there shows, is the contributions that could come in from unclaimed property. Figure 2 talks about that $300,000 cap. So you remember that the proposal has a few features. It's to raise the dollar threshold on that old unclaimed property from $100 to $150, but it would also limit the amount of money from this unclaimed property that can go to Vermont Saves or the Higher Ed Trust Fund at a combined limit of $300,000, which is why all of those bars in figure 2 are at $300,000. So it shows you that over time, as there is expected to be less of a need to prop up Vermont Saves, there would be more of this balance available to go to the Higher Ed Trust Fund. Something I want to note here is that, notwithstanding that redirection of money to Vermont Saves, by increasing that dollar threshold from $100 to $150, it is expected that the Higher Ed Trust Fund is going to receive more money from unclaimed property than they would under status quo law. And it's because when you raise that threshold from $100 to $150, you're capturing a whole lot more unclaimed property that would be eligible for transfer. And if you want to take a look at table 1 on page 3, this shows you some historical data of recent amounts that were transferred from this unclaimed property to the Higher Ed Trust Fund. So last year, $147,000 was transferred. That was the largest year in recent memory. And that was under the $100 threshold. If that threshold was at $150 instead of at $100,
you would have seen a substantial increase in the amount of money that would have been eligible to go in there. So that's just another way of taking a look at how much of a difference that is by raising that threshold.
And just clarifying, perhaps I'll speak to the treasurer too. We're not, by transferring it this way, it's still available for claim.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
We're not taking the money, we're just moving it to a different investment stream.
Correct, correct. And I also want to mention, because Ledge Council accurately pointed out the interaction with the general fund. I want to tell you all that I really don't, after conversations with the state treasurer's office, I really don't think this proposal is going to have a material impact to the general fund. Because the amount of money we're dealing with is so small in the big picture. You're expecting $7.5 million to come from unclaimed property to the general fund in FY27. And in the last few years, the actual amounts transferred in have exceeded the budgeted estimate by several $million a year. So when we're talking about a couple $100,000 at play, I really don't think this is a material consideration for the estimate that you're building FY27 around, or how much money is going to be available in the future, because the actuals that are available that have been available to transfer in once the books have been closed have been healthier than the earlier estimates that the budget has been built around. And this hasn't been by like $10. This has been by a fairly healthy cushion. And the unclaimed property system continues to have more and more property going into it. So that's just a long way of saying that I didn't even acknowledge that in the fiscal note because I didn't think it was enough of a consideration to type it out, but I wanted to explain it to you.
And you don't deal with political issues, so as a rule, so this is something that somebody will say, what do you mean you're taking it, putting it someplace else? So it's just a clarification.
And I appreciate the question. So the pension, we'll move on to the next section, if that's all right. The Pension and Benefits Funding Task Force, I think we hit on this earlier. This is a slimmed down version of the task force from 2021, but it still has a good mix of legislators and representatives of the affected employee groups. And I think the focus here is less on the whole retirement system writ large and more narrowly focused on making sure that the funding plan in place for addressing the unfunded liabilities is sustainable, it's predictable, it's something we can manage, and that we're following best practices. I think personally, as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about the pension system, I think the legislature needs to have this conversation at some point, because 2038 is a date that we're going to hit at some point. And as was mentioned, the risk of really wacky things happening with the contributions increases as you get closer to 2038. One easy example to get your head around is if the market tanked in 2033, that would impact the ADAC payments beginning in 2035 due to the timing issues involved. By that point, you've got 4 years to spread that impact across. So as you get closer and closer to that time, the risk of things happening that cause the funding requirements of the budget to get really, really wacky, that risk increases. And it's good to have this conversation when things are relatively normal economically and not when you're trying to close a $200 million budget deficit.
And so would we not, is this 2038 date so set in stone that if something happened, like Spanish Inquisition, nobody expected that, and yet, do we have an opportunity to move it out forward if that's the crisis?
I think that is exactly the question that this task force is looking to answer, in terms of what if the situation warrants the legislature to bump out that date, or to modify it, or to think about new unfunded liabilities that occur. What should be the plan for addressing it? Would it make sense, for example, right now everything's on a single closed layer. Would it make sense to phase in a layered amortization approach instead, where every year might be amortized on its own 15 or 20 years? So some systems do it that way. these are the types of questions that I think this group would really dig into. So the legislature has a plan should they need to pull the trigger.
They might come back with suggestions, every couple of years we take a report, or if something happens in 32, we do these, or Plan B or Plan C or whatever.
So yeah, we expect, that $75,000 appropriation, the per diems are going to be pretty small for the two legislative members, about $3,600 out of the total. The vast majority of this money would be to pay the actuaries to run scenarios. Transitioning OPEB fiduciary oversight to VPIC, you all a few years ago funded a governance study in the treasurer's office to take a look at this question. And the report is available on the legislative website. It came out in January of 2024 and basically highlighted as like the primary recommendation would be to shift from the current sole fiduciary model to having VPIC be the fiduciaries for the OPEB systems. So all of this language effectuates that recommendation. Something I wanted to point out to you is that there are going to be impacts to the VPIC and the state treasurer's budgets if you decide to move forward with this, because some costs are going to have to shift around from the treasurer's office over to VPIC's budget. The treasurer's office, for example, manages an investment consulting contract that they would no longer need to be the ones holding the dollars to fund that if it moves over to VPIC. VPIC has also identified the need for an additional position to help manage this. That position is not included in the bill, but it was an identified need that they raised in testimony. All of these costs at VPIC would be apportioned proportionately against the retirement assets that the system manages. So these are not general fund asks. I think we talked about the elective retirement credit issue. And I just wanted to mention that, there are parallels elsewhere for purchases of service credit that are similar. You can purchase military service, Peace Corps service, things like that. So I think the key here is that the payments would be calculated on an actuarially neutral basis, and the payments would be made by the employee organization, the labor union, as opposed to the state. So we do not expect this will have additional costs on the state's pension funding requirements. And the reason VMERS is also mentioned in here is because an awful lot of public school employees are in VMERS. The teachers are in the teacher system, the non-teaching staff, many of them are in VMERS. And then there are 3 positions at the Office of the State Treasurer. None of these require a general fund ask. They would be funded by special funds. So there's an item in here for 2 full-time classified program techs and unclaimed property. Those would be funded from unclaimed property proceeds, and 1 full-time policy and research manager in the retirement division. And those costs are paid proportionately from the 3 retirement systems, because that's part of, administering those systems. So that is the juicy and thrilling 6-page fiscal note on this bill. If you all have any other questions that we didn't get to, happy to entertain them.
It's a nice fiscal note.
Thank you.
Substantive.
Yep.
Yes, Lynn.
Okay. All right, you just made a point of saying that there's a consulting contract for the treasurer that would involve in whatever they do with OPEB or things of that kind. It's going to be transferred to VPIC, which is one position.
No, they're two separate
issues. But VPIC will need another position to take on the extra responsibility, from what I understand.
Correct.
Okay, because it's a complicated issue to handle OPEC.
Correct, and there's 4 FTEs at VPIC right now. And they're managing quite a few billion and growing.
Yes, and they have an issue with compensation, which I think there's been a study for that. Now, if you're going to be consulting the contract for Treasury because they've transferred its responsibility, or partly because they've done it, and that's in the is that in the 27 budget?
Yeah. Well, one of the things we would need to do is the GovRec budget does not reflect any of these moves. So if you all would agree with what's proposed in this bill, what I would do afterwards is work with VPIC and with the treasurer's office and figure out what numbers need to move around between the two budgets. And then we would present that to you all when you look at the FY 27 budget proposal.
Okay, then the next question is, you have two full-time positions in the class unclaimed property and one full-time for retirement division. So those are three full-time positions going to the treasurer. Are they in the governor would recommend?
They're not.
Okay, then I have a question, if I could, for the representative from the treasurer's office.
Yes, if you'd like to come forward.
Happy to.
Please.
Yes.
Okay. I know that one of the issues that the unclaimed property has is fraud.
Yes.
What kind of data do you have on that? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? I know this is one of the reasons for the two. I believe you came in and out. Maybe you weren't here then, but the treasurer office came in and asked for those. Last year, my understanding is he did not get those two. So we're asking for it again. You're asking for it again. What's the status and what the data can you give us on the fraud issues?
For the record, David Scher, Deputy Treasurer. I can say that we have, as of even just last week, caught what we believe to be, I don't want to presume, but what we believe to be a fraudulent inquiry for somewhere north of a $20,000 chunk of unclaimed property. So those are issues that continue and do require attention and time. And they do mean, addressing that issue. We do have a risk management person in the office who helps with this, but it does slow down the processing of all these claims. More broadly, also, the office had, in FY 23, I believe the total amount of claims was 18,500, totaling about 3.8 million. When you look at FY 25, that went up to 31,500 claims, with claims paid totaling 9.45 million. So really quite a dramatic increase in the workload in addition to the fraud issues that we continue to see. And on top of that, one thing that the unclaimed property division would be able to do more of, and which would help all of us ultimately, is to work on compliance issues more fulsomely than they are now. In other words, making sure the unclaimed property that's out there is in fact getting turned in to the state as required. Right now, they're able to do a little bit of that. They would be able to do more of that. And ultimately, that would be a benefit to all of us if that were able to happen more. But with this really quite dramatic increase in claims processed and amount of money going out, it has been challenging to do as much of that as the division would like.
Okay, thank you. Can you tell me more about the contract that we're going to be canceling, or that the state, or the treasurer office don't need as much?
Are you talking about with respect to the OPEB work? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So Chris knows this as well as I do, but there's a contract with a vendor that's called RBK that helps with the management of those funds that is specific to the OPEB scope of work. And so since the OPEB scope of work is going over to VPIC, that contract, I don't want to say it'll be a one-to-one transfer, that there will be some work that will have to be done between the two entities, but that scope of work will be transferring it. So the contract will be reworked in some way to acknowledge that.
How much is that? Does anyone know?
It's 26,000 a quarter.
Wayne, you have a question?
Yeah, you say a person to collect unclaimed property, so I'm presuming banks. What other kinds of places did you get unclaimed property?
There's banks. We have got, in terms of like large institutions, banks, companies that for whatever reason aren't able to find an entity that they're supposed to pay, which does happen sometimes. Insurers who aren't able to match, the person or the account that it's supposed to go to. And so they're needing to turn stuff over to hospitals ultimately, so that could transfer into us. And so, when I say compliance, I don't mean to insinuate that people are willfully not doing what they're supposed to do. although that, I suppose that certainly could be the case, really just emphasizing that people need to understand their obligations.
So there's statutory obligations for them to turn it in at a certain point in time.
That's exactly right.
And if they don't, and no one checks, nobody knows, you could have fraud at that end also.
That is true. And again, I'm not indicating that that's the case, but we certainly know that we need to raise awareness around the
If you had
obligations.
a person that was working on that, then they might be able to impact any, or forego that kind of behavior.
That's exactly right.
Okay, any further questions on this bill and the fiscal? Yes.
Yeah, just so thanks for the reminder about the increase in my property things you're dealing with here per day here. What's the current staffing of the folks working that part of?
I believe we have 4 people in that division, and I will
I'm asking.
share that.
It didn't sound like.
Because we had a temporary person, so I can't remember what that brought it to. I know that the unclaimed property division director, I think, is watching this right now, so hopefully he'll get that very shortly.
Send you a note shortly.
Exactly, yeah,
Thanks a lot. I knew it was just a handful.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a small number dealing with a lot of.
Yeah, a lot of.
Okay, just a reminder on this bill, our chair had indicated, obviously, we're not gonna vote on it right now, but to review all the information. We realize that we may have to make a very slight correction of Cam's numbers, and just keep that in mind, and we will review this again as we start thinking about putting the numbers together of the costs involved with various things.
And we're happy to be available to the committee when you look at this again.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go off live. We have a bit of a break, but at 11 o'clock, we are going to be hearing from various legislators, all in person. Is that true?
With the positions.
About